Dear friends, good morning. It's the 25th of November, I think, and we're in Shallowford and also online. And this is the retreat for Sangha facilitators. We all need a Sangha if our practice is to be sustainable. And I was very heartened to hear Thai say that he set up Plum Village for his own support. And I think if it's good enough for Thai, then it's got to be good enough for me too. So I think it is a really important part of our practice, being part of a Sangha. We learn a lot from each other, and we learn a lot from having to work with other people, things that we wouldn't learn if we were just practicing by ourselves. So when I first started in this practice, really there weren't any local Sanghas. Well, there was a group that met in London. I remember Vari going to that group as well. And but it was, it was people coming from all over the place, once a month to go down to London for a meeting. And then gradually, as we became more established, local Sanghas started to spring up. And Thai always made it very clear that anybody could set up a Sangha. Anybody who had experience of the practice could set up a Sangha. And I have to say, initially that seemed like a very risky policy. But it really, it works. And if the practice is strong, then a new Sangha will thrive and will continue. And if the practice is not strong, it'll disappear. So it's a kind of survival of the fittest. And we've ended up with some really strong Sanghas in the UK, which is great. And of course, the practice in the Sangha relies quite heavily on the people who are facilitating that Sangha. And so it relies on the practice of the facilitators to keep the atmosphere calm, steady, and focused, as well as having fun. And I think the joy element is really important. Of course, it's not always easy. Working with other people is often more challenging than doing the job ourselves. And so it's a little like, pebbles in a bucket rubbing against each other. We rub off the sharp edges off each other, and it's not always a comfortable process, but it is a very worthwhile one. We have to learn to let go of our own agendas and to accept other people as they are, and not to get caught in judgments and opinions. So, in many ways, Sangha facilitation is part of our growing practice, our practice of growing ourselves, growing our capacity for coping with the world. And it's also an opportunity to offer other people what we've, the joy, the calm, and the steadiness that we found ourselves in the practice. So it's a bodhisattva path. So let's think a little bit about facilitation. I think it's worth saying at the outset that the word facilitate means to make easy. Doesn't mean to lead or to control. It means to make easy. And I think that's a really helpful thing to bear in mind when we're leading the practice, in inverted commas. So if we are going to facilitate, we need to be stable in our own practice when we go into that space. And of course, when we start to facilitate, it's quite natural to feel anxious about it. And in some ways, that actually helps us to be present in the moment. But at the same time, we also need to know how to manage that anxiety so that it doesn't transmit to the other people in the group. I know if we have people in the Cambridge Sangha who come regularly, maybe for a year, then we will encourage them to become facilitators. And I can see, when they start, often they're quite anxious. They might be anxious about inviting the bell. They might be anxious about introducing a subject or facilitating a discussion group. And so we try to make sure that they've got adequate support. We usually have somebody who is there as a second body to support them. And my experience of new Sanghas is that usually the Sanghas that survive are the ones that start with at least 2 people, because they can support each other. If we are going to ask people to become facilitators, then we also, in Cambridge, we actually have semi-regular facilitators meetings. And you probably couldn't tell by looking that this was a facilitators meeting. It looks like people having fun. We usually have a meal together, ask people to bring food to share. It's often a really good meal. People tend to bring of their best, which is great. And then, as I say, there's lots of chat, lots of smiles, lots of friendship. And then after a while, we'll actually discuss things that might be relevant to facilitation. The way that we do things, any difficulties that have come up, things that we might want to change. And it's really interesting that approach of kind of sharing a meal automatically helps people to kind of relax and be present. And rather than having a business meeting to sort out difficulties, it's just a, part of a broader program. So yes, I mentioned last night the very first thing that I heard Tai say, that if our practice is not bringing us peace and joy, we're not really practicing. Of course, that may not always be true. It's not always going to be joyful and peaceful, but in the bigger picture, those are important criteria. And so we need to think about, making our practice sustainable as facilitators. So actually finding joy and peace in that practice is important. And we also need to make sure that we don't hog the limelight. We need to give space for other people. And so again, in the Cambridge Sangha, we meet in each other's homes most of the time. And we have a rule, I think it's the only rule that we have in the Sangha, that says whoever is facilitating does not also host. So we spread the energy out. And that has stood us in good stead over time. I've certainly seen Sanghas that, meet always in one place, in one person's home. That can get to be a burden after a while. And we need to think about those things so that we don't actually get into that doing things out of a sense of duty. Because when that happens, things start to go wrong. I had this happen myself in Cambridge, because for a long time I was asked to facilitate. And after a while, it began to be a burden. And at that point, one person in the Sangha started to question everything that I was doing in quite a destructive way. And it wasn't of my choosing, but I was being perceived as being the person who had the power. And that person obviously had a reaction to that. So we need to be aware of the dynamics within the Sangha, within the group, and try and make sure that we don't get into sort of power situations. So when we take on the role of a facilitator, essentially what we're trying to do is to create a safe environment for people to practice in. And that means that we need to have some consistency of practice. So people have a sense of safety. They know, there's going to be a bell, and so on. It's very easy to get hung up on the form of the practice. And I'm sure many of you are aware, Plum Village changed the form quite regularly. I used to be quite a stickler for the form until I realized that. And actually, with visiting a lot of local Sanghas, I find that actually the form tends to be different in every Sangha. And I don't have a problem with that anymore. It doesn't matter. The important thing is that it's consistent within that Sangha. And that means that if we've got several facilitators, we need to agree amongst ourselves how we're going to do it. Yeah? So we also help people to feel safe if we provide a program of what's going to happen and explain if any changes have to happen, then that's fine, but we just need to make it clear that that's what's happening. And flexibility is actually, one of the products of the practice, and a very important part of it, that we do need to be able to adapt to circumstances. Here at Shallowford, we're actually sitting, when we meditate, facing inwards, because the room is not really big enough for us to sit 2 meters from the wall, facing the wall, which is the tradition in the Zen schools. But of course, if you go to Plum Village, people sit facing out. It's okay. We've chosen and we do our own thing. But as I say, it's something that we need to think about and agree with other people. And when we find ourselves coming to somewhere like this, where we've got quite a lot of people in a room that's only just big enough, then we actually have to adapt what we do. So Suzuki Roshi once said that, we have to, people often think that they have to adapt the circumstances to suit them. Well, actually in the Sangha, we have to adapt ourselves to suit the circumstances. So when we're facilitating, it's not just, of course, what we say or even what we do. A lot of human communication is actually non-verbal. You see different figures quoted, somewhere between 80 and 90% is non-verbal. So if we can be stable and calm and at ease, then it helps the people around us to feel the same. And that's not always easy. We all have difficulties come up in our lives. We all have difficult times. And we all need at some point to swallow our ego and say, I'm sorry, I can't do this. Would you mind taking over? And that's fine. That's part of the learning process. So we need, when we're facilitating, to be as much at ease as possible. If our muscles are tense, then the sounds of the bell will be harsh and people can hear that. We tend to talk too much. We tend to become controlling. And all of those things are unhelpful. So we need to be able to do what we need to do as a facilitator in a calm and steady way. When we are sitting in a Sangha, we tend to find, that we have a number of people there who are likely to be experienced in the practice, and we may also have newcomers. Some of those newcomers may stay on and become regulars. Some of them may move on. That's fine. The door swings both ways. But it's important, I think, that when we do have newcomers come to the Sangha, that we make them feel welcome. We try and help them to know what's going to happen, but at the same time, not to make them feel self-conscious. And so it's helpful, I think, if we're going to introduce a session of walk, sit, actually that when we do that, we do it to everybody, not just to the newcomers. And moreover, we stay in the present. We deal with what's immediately coming up. The next bell means, please massage your legs. And the next bell, when it comes, means we'll stand up, rather than trying to give a whole long list that people aren't going to remember. And of course, it's also worth reminding them that, you know, if in doubt, look around and see what other people are doing. So that's one aspect of helping newcomers. I think something else that some people struggle with is to find a comfortable sitting position. And this is something that actually changes with age. I now sit an inch higher than I used to because my knees are getting a little more creaky, and that's fine. But basically, when we're sitting, we need to have a position that's stable and comfortable and upright. You know, if we are in a chair and we're sort of slumping physically, then our mind will start to slump as well. And so, you know, if we are going to sit in a chair for meditation, then actually I would suggest sitting so that, you know, your weight is partly on your feet, both feet, and also on your bottom, and that you're not relying too much on the back of the chair. And the same applies if you're sitting on the floor. And the height at which you sit has a big effect. You know, if I sit too high and I'm having to arch my shoulders forward to keep my center of gravity over my sitting bones, and that means that I'm going to get a pain in the upper part of my back. And if I sit too low, if I sit too low, I'll also get a pain in my back. Yeah. So adjusting your height to suit yourself. And if you have somebody who's clearly having discomfort during their sitting, you know, it's worth asking them, you know, if they'd like some help with finding the right situation in which to sit. And there's nothing wrong, of course, with sitting in a chair. The only difference between sitting in a chair and sitting on the floor is the position of the legs. Yeah? That's not a critical feature. We don't have to sit in full lotus. You know, it's not obligatory. So, yeah. But as I say, these are things that, you know, you probably might introduce after a little while when somebody's been sitting for a while and clearly having some problem, then you might want to talk about that. Something else that beginners sometimes struggle with is what meditation is. I remember having a discussion with my PhD supervisor. Harry will smile because he knows him. He couldn't believe that when we were meditating, we weren't thinking about something. You know, it was a complete anathema to him. He was not a practitioner. And I think, you know, often, and I recognize when I started sitting, it took me a long time to realize that actually when we're practicing mindful breathing, what we're trying to do is just experience our breathing. We're not thinking about it. Yeah, I can feel my breathing down in my abdomen as I'm talking now, but I'm not thinking about it. If I'm doing mindfulness of breathing, then I try to make that the full focus of my attention. But I'm not thinking about when's the next breath coming. You know, is it going to come? You know, I'm actually just experiencing my breathing. And if I struggle to do that, then I find putting my hand on my abdomen and feeling my hand move is actually quite helpful. And I'll often introduce that as an idea to newcomers. Of course, staying with our breathing is not always easy, especially if we've got lots of other things going on in our heads. Thoughts come in, and it's very easy to kind of drift off. So, if we are trying to practice in a consistent way, then we may choose to actually to count our breaths. It is a way of helping to stay focused, counting, breathing in, breathing out, 1, breathing in, breathing out, 2, and so on, up to 10, and then start again at 1. It just helps to maintain our focus. Something else that is quite helpful is actually to recognize our own mental state before we start, and actually think about, am I feeling dozy? If I am, I definitely need to sit with my eyes open. Sort of soft focus, just a couple of meters in front of me. Whereas if my mind is racing, then sometimes it's helpful to have my eyes closed. But traditionally in Zen practice, we sit with our eyes open. It doesn't have to be like that, just as we don't have to sit on a stool or on a cushion. It's a question of learning what we need. And we can help other people in the Sangha to find their own needs, to recognize their own needs and respond appropriately as facilitators. And of course, we can also use guided meditations to help people to kind of come into the present and get focused before we then go into mindfulness of breathing practice. I think something else that we have to be careful of as facilitators is during Dharma sharing, we don't have to have all the answers. It's very easy for people to kind of, come up with a difficulty they're having, and for me then to want to help them to fix it. And that is not necessarily helpful. Just for somebody to be able to feel safe enough to share a difficulty is already helping them to deal with it. It's important, I think, to allow space. And as facilitators, there will be plenty of wisdom in the Sangha. Doesn't need us to jump in all the time and come up with all the answers. In terms of Dharma sharing, obviously it depends on the size of our Sangha, whether we actually do it, all together, or whether we split into groups. Optimum size is probably around between 4 and 6 people in a group. That allows people plenty of time to share. If we've got a bigger group, then we need to allow more time, or we may need to think about splitting the group. And it's worth being aware that some people feel quite inhibited about sharing in a big group. Some people feel inhibited about sharing in a small group. So we have to try and find a balance with these things. And it's always great to have newcomers come to the Sangha. Beginners don't have any preconceptions. Again, Suzuki Roshi used to say, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there is only one. And we need that openness to allow people to share their beginner's mind, because there's a freshness about their practice which we can all benefit from. I think it's also important, I think, to recognize that it's not all milk and honey in a Sangha. Difficulties will arise. Individuals have difficulties. There may be difficulties between people in Sanghas. And it's important, I think, to recognize those things and to try to address them in an appropriate way. I went to one Sangha, should be nameless, and don't think there's anybody here from it, but somebody referred to them as a WI Sangha, a Women's Institute Sangha. It was all very nice, but it wasn't going to any depth because people weren't actually sharing difficulties and difficulties weren't being addressed. Interpersonal difficulties weren't being addressed in the group. So if we have a personal difficulty, I don't know about you, but my tendency is to try and look the other way and pretend it doesn't exist. And I think we all tend to do that. The Buddha said, difficulties will arise. This is the first arrow and it hurts. The second arrow may follow if we don't deal with the first arrow in an appropriate way. Yeah? And if we just try and pretend that the first arrow didn't hit us, then the consequences of that will build up. And the second arrow will be even more painful because it's the consequences of not dealing with the first arrow. So we definitely need to address difficulties if they come up. And it's not easy. It may involve having to begin anew with somebody with whom we're having difficulties in the Sangha. I've had to do that a few times. And it's a really useful experience. It's a useful practice. If you're not familiar with it, I'm not going to go into it in great detail now, but it's a way of helping both parties to hear what the other person is saying in a non-judgmental way. As I say, you'll find it in the manual of practice on the Plum Village UK website in the resources section. There's a useful Dharma talk by Brother Bao Tang from Plum Village on it on YouTube as well. And it is a really important practice, I think. And sometimes if somebody is having a difficulty, it may be that all they need is actually to be able to share that and to feel heard. And so, if that is the case, they may feel comfortable sharing in the Sangha, or they may actually approach somebody, an individual, to want to talk about. And, if that happens, somebody approaches me, if I can stay calm, not get caught up in their difficulty, but also to be empathic about what it means to them, it really helps them to deal with it. And I think that's something that I've really seen in action in Plum Village Dharma discussion groups at times. It really can work very well. When I first used to go to Plum Village, we had a lot of Vietnam vets come, people who'd served in Vietnam. and many of them had really severe mental problems after that, PTSD, and many of them also drug addictions and things like that. And actually just being in that space and being heard and being held was enormously helpful to those people. So it's important to recognize that value. Of course, Sangha is not intended, it's not a therapy group. We're not setting ourselves up as an alternative to therapy, but we certainly can help with some situations just by the way in which we allow people to share their difficulties. So just a sort of few things to share. I think many Sanghas will use Dharma talks, often from Plum Village. And I know in the past we used to use CDs, and I have to say that, having a video is a lot easier to stay focused. It's very easy if you're just listening to a CD to kind of drift off into your own thoughts, whereas the moving image makes quite a difference. And something that we tended to do in the UK after a Dharma talk, either given by a Dharma teacher or a Plum Village one, is actually then to actually immediately follow that with a chance to people to ask any questions or to emphasize any points that they'd like to, because it helps people to, processing the information in that way helps to fix it rather than just, just another video. Yeah. So that's something that I think is really quite helpful. Other things that we've done in the Cambridge Sangha, which we've found to be helpful, we had a newcomer, actually just before the pandemic, who came to us from mindfulness-based stress reduction. She had no experience of Buddhism at all, and she really wanted to find out. And after a few months, she said, would it be okay to set up a reading group? And that was a really good thing to do. And it's gone right the way through the pandemic. It's still going, reading around a topic as a group, encouraging people to bring in their own thoughts and their own readings, and exploring the breadth of the Buddha Dharma. There's a lot out there. I think we started with Ty's book, The Heart of the Buddha's Teaching, the one with all the lists, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the 12 Nidanas, and so on and so forth. And and that was quite helpful in terms of getting a grounding in basic Buddhism. To say that's once a month, not on a Sangha evening. We have it on a separate evening, and we now do it both on Zoom and in person. So if people want to get together, they can do, but we also have a Zoom link. And the same with our Sangha meetings now, we do that. We also have a outside walking meditation twice a month, or 3 times a month at the moment, on a Saturday morning at 8 o'clock in the morning, whatever the weather, in a country park in Cambridge, or just outside Cambridge. And we meet and we possibly share a short reading, and then we walk together for probably half an hour in silence. And then if people want to talk after that, that's fine. And then at the end of that time, we'll go and have breakfast in a cafe. And actually, it's been a really bonding thing to do. We have some people who come to that with their children and their dogs who we never see at any other time, but they still feel they're part of the Sangha and they really contribute to the energy. So it's a really helpful thing to do. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that many of us these days work with our heads, and that, for me, when I was, working in the university, actually the most difficult thing I ever did was doing sitting meditation, trying just to stay with the experience. Much easier was actually walking meditation, or to do yoga or Tai Chi. Things that bring me out of my head and into my body are really important, I think. And, with a lot of us, I think, those things are probably going to be a useful way of reconnecting with ourselves and making it possible then for us to have a meaningful sitting meditation. So I think it's worth recognizing the needs that some people have in that respect. In the past, when people worked with their hands, and I've done that, I worked as a boat builder for 2 years, and it's really interesting the effect that it had on my mind. My mind really calmed down, and then I really could do sitting meditation. Now I'm just pretending. Yeah. So, those things do make a difference. And of course, in the past, more people did work with their hands. And so the practice they needed was different. So horses for courses. So, when we're, as facilitators, talking about having a day of mindfulness or the way that the evening practice will be structured, we need to try and keep a balance of those things. A balance between sitting meditation, body work of some description, open space, a chance to connect with other people and share, as well as time to have fun. Singing is good. It's really interesting. I used to do a lot of work with Quakers at Woodbrook in Birmingham. And, often when I introduced the idea of singing plum village songs, people would say, "Oh, but I haven't sung since I was at school," Well, there is something very heartwarming about singing. It really opens the heart, and it can be really helpful. And, some of the intervals in some of the Plum Village songs also have an emotional resonance. You think of Namo Velo. At times I find it difficult to sing that without crying. It really does have a big impact. And so using those things in the Sangha can also be really helpful to help people connect, as well as to help them to deal with difficult situations. And of course, almost all those things are now available on the Plum Village app. So, I don't have to remember all the words or have a, capacity to hold the key. I can, have the app on and we can use that as a background. So, yeah, as I say, I think I'm going to finish at this point just with a brief story from the time of the Buddha. And then we'll open it for questions or comments. But one day, Ananda, who was the Buddha's attendant for many years, he was Buddha's cousin, but he was his attendant. He'd been practicing with the Buddha for quite a long time, and he came to the Buddha with, saying, "Oh, I've had this great insight." And the Buddha smiled, and Ananda said, "I've just realized that Sangha is half of the spiritual life." And the Buddha shook his head. "No, Ananda. Sangha is the whole of the spiritual life."